everyone. In this lecture we're going to talk about one of the rhetorical modes that we study in this class, compare and contrast. And remember, a rhetorical mode is a method of development. What is our purpose? What are we trying to do? Are we talking about the ways that things are the same? Are we talking about the ways that they're different? Are we arguing a point? Are we narrating a story? What is it we're doing? That's what rhetorical mode means. And for this lecture, we're going to talk about comparing and contrasting. When we compare and contrast, we ask ourselves two questions. How are these things alike? And how are these things different? That's what we're talking about. And we ask ourselves those questions, and then we explore those questions in our paper. When we compare two things, we talk about similarities. So we want to remember the synonyms that go with these particular rhetorical methods. Compare would be alike, and similarities and same. So when we compare two things, we talk about the ways in which they're the same, and when we contrast, we talk about the way that things are different or dissimilar or unalike. Now, depending on what your essay is asking of you or what you as the writer decide to how you decide to develop your essay, sometimes you're just going to compare. Sometimes you're just going to talk about the similarities of two things, and sometimes you're just going to talk about the differences. Sometimes you'll do both, and that's fine. What you have to remember as you prepare this essay, this type of essay, and as you write this type of essay, is that it needs to be incredibly clear to your reader what it is you're doing. Are you talking about comparisons? Are you contrasting? Or are you doing both? You want to state it in the thesis statement up front, and then you want to remind your reader really frequently what it is you're doing. Now, before you begin to outline an essay like this, you really need to establish a basis of comparison. And to do that, you need to select two things that share similarities. All right, two types of the same thing. Now, Lake Michigan and Lake Allen Henry may have no similarities whatsoever, except that they're both large bodies of water. All right, they're both lakes, and so they would be okay for comparison. We can't really write a paper on Lake Michigan and Slide Road in Lubbock. They're two different types of things, and so that would just not make any sense to our reader. So we want to be sure we're comparing and contrasting two types of the same things. We could compare and contrast Lake Michigan and the Mediterranean Sea. Even though one is a lake and one is a sea, they're both large bodies of water. So we could establish a basis for comparison there. What we also want to be sure of when we're establishing a basis for comparison is that we're not talking about one type of something, like Lake Michigan and all other lakes in general. Lake Michigan is just a type of lake or an example of a lake, and that's a completely different type of composition, a completely different rhetorical mode. So you want to be sure that you're very specific, that you're comparing and contrasting two things. Like, you couldn't compare Harry Potter and all of the other people in Dumbledore's army. You need to do it on a one-for-one basis. Harry Potter and Ronald Weasley, or Harry Potter and Hermione, or Harry Potter and Draco. Okay? Once you've figured out what you're going to compare and contrast, you need to develop criteria, and you have to establish common elements that you're going to be discussing in your paper. A couple of examples here. We have poem 1 and poem 2. It's important to understand that we have to use the same criteria for both of our topics here. So if I talk about rhythm, symbolism, and theme for poem 1, I have to talk about rhythm, symbolism, and theme for poem 2. I can't talk about rhythm, symbolism, and theme for poem 1 and then talk about imagery, metaphor, and figures of speech for poem 2. That's not comparing and contrasting. Okay? I can't even talk about rhythm, symbolism, and theme for poem 1, rhythm, symbolism, and theme, and imagery for point 2. If I'm going to talk about imagery here, I have to talk about it here as well. Those are criteria. Those are points of comparison. All right? The same can be said with Lake Allen Henry and Lake Michigan. If I'm going to talk about depth, size, and tourism for one, I have to talk about depth, size, and tourism for the other. And they may not be the same. Depth for Lake Allen Henry and Lake Michigan, I have no idea, but that could be the same. Size could be different. Tourism could be the same. But if we're talking about these 3 things for one topic, we have to talk about the exact same 3 things for the second topic, which kind of leads to our next couple of slides, phrasing the thesis and organizing our body paragraphs. Like I said in the beginning of this lecture, you have to make it really, really clear what it is you're doing for your reader. You never want them to be confused, and you don't need to worry that you're being too obvious in your thesis statement. Your thesis statement for this type of composition has to have 2 things. Number 1, it has to state both of the topics. All right, so if you're comparing and contrasting Lake Allen Henry and Lake Michigan, those words need to be in your thesis. Number 2, you need to tell the reader what your rhetorical mode is. What are you going to do? Are you going to compare? Are you going to contrast? Or are you going to do both? Now, this is essential. When we talked about thesis statements in a previous lecture, we also said that if a topic had natural divisions, that we could include those in the thesis. And I would. Let me show you an example. Whereas Lake Michigan and Lake Allen Henry appear quite different in terms of their location, they show important similarities in other areas. Now here we have topic 1, topic 2, differences, similarities. Awesome. So it meets the first 2 criteria here. Our last one here, we're going to skip around. This last one, Lake Michigan and Lake Allen Henry have important similarities and differences. Awesome. We have our 2 topics. We have our rhetorical mode. And that's very general, but that's okay. All right? That's fine. That works. The best option for our thesis statement is, whereas Lake Michigan and Lake Allen Henry are both large bodies of water, they are very different in terms of their depth, size, and tourism industries. So now for this one, we have not only the topic, we have the rhetorical mode, we also have those natural divisions. And now my reader can expect that the first body paragraph is going to be about this, the second body paragraph about that, and the third body paragraph about that. And it's very specific, very detailed. Again, you don't want to worry about making it too obvious for your reader. Your thesis statement should tell them exactly what you're doing. As far as structure goes, we have a couple of options. The first is whole by whole, and in whole by whole organization, we talk about one topic, topic 1, and then we talk about the second topic. And you'll notice we have the points of comparison here. We have depth, A, we have size, and we have tourism, and that's fine. And in this particular type of organization, you probably just have 2 body paragraphs. Point by point organization is a little bit different. Rather than concentrate and put the focus on our topics, we're going to break our essay down by points of comparison. So we're going to talk about depth, topic 1, topic 2. We're going to talk about the second point of comparison, topic 1, topic 2, and then the third point of comparison, topic 1, topic 2. Now, when I write compare and contrast essay, this is the structure that I like to use because it's really, really obvious to the reader that you are comparing and contrasting 2 things, because this will be in the same paragraph. So you're going to talk about depth, and then you're going to talk about both of your subjects, and there's no way really for your reader to get away from the fact that you are comparing and contrasting. And you have to remember your purpose is to compare and contrast. Alright? In this type of essay, many students neglect to connect these two topics together. So they talk about Lake Allen Henry, depth, size, and tourism. They talk about Lake Michigan, depth, size, and tourism. They don't connect them together. We're not really comparing and contrasting. Rather, students give information about this one, and then we give information about this one, and that's not the purpose. Our purpose is not to inform. Our purpose is to compare and contrast. So again, I think this one works better as a writer and as a reader. If you choose to use this one, of course, that is totally and completely up to you. But what I want you to remember is that you have to remind your reader that you are comparing and contrasting these two things. You're not just talking about this one and then talking about this one. You're talking about similarities and differences. And to do that, we use transitional expressions, and this is huge in this type of essay. We want to be sure that when we're comparing things, we're talking about similarities, we lead our reader from one idea to the next. We tell them exactly what we're doing. We're talking about similarities. And to do that, we use transitional expressions like in the same way, by the same token, similarly, in a like manner, likewise, in a similar fashion. And you always want to remember those synonyms for compare. Similar, same, alike. My handwriting is not awesome. All right, we want to remind our reader over and over what it is we're talking about, and we never want to feel like we're being too obvious, okay? Don't feel that way. Lead them from one idea to the next. You don't want them getting lost. In the same way, we use transitional expressions for contrast to show differences. And so some synonyms for this would be differences, dissimilarities, dissimilar, unalike. All right, and transitional expressions, yet, nevertheless, nonetheless, but, however, on the contrary, in contrast, on the other hand, though. These all indicate to your reader that you're talking about the way that these things are different. And you need to be sure as you're writing your paper, as you're working on your draft, that these are incorporated. Again, you never want your reader to wonder, what is my writer talking about? Are they talking about how things are the same or how they're different? I'm not sure. You never want them to think, I'm not sure. You tell them explicitly. The other thing I want to do in this lecture is show you an example of successful student writing. Of course, nobody's writing is 100% perfect, and you can see the student didn't use Times New Roman. But what the student has done is they have crafted a really good thesis statement, and they have really good organization and structure. And so our writer here tells us in the very beginning, in the pursuit of higher education, students will fall into one of two different groups of people. And then she tells us here what our topics are. Active students versus passive students. Okay, we're going to talk about those two groups. Other than the fact that both groups are attending college, they differ. So she's going to talk about how these groups are different when it comes to motivation, prioritizing time management, and overall attitude and involvement. This is a great thesis statement because our writer has told us, again, other than the fact that both groups, now she says both groups here, doesn't explicitly name active and passive students, but she's already told us that, so it flows pretty naturally. She's told us that what the rhetorical mode is, and she's told us these natural divisions. She's going to talk about motivation, prioritizing and time management, and overall student involvement. So that is a great thesis statement. Then in her body paragraph, the topic sentence for each of her body paragraphs tells us, reminds us of the thesis. Difference between an active and a passive student. So this part reminds us of the thesis, and this part, source of motivation, tells us what this paragraph is going to be about. All right, and she concentrates on one particular point per paragraph. So remember, a topic sentence has to do both. It has to remind the reader of the thesis and tell the reader what the paragraph is going to be about. We scroll down, we see that she has continued this pattern, an active student and a passive student vary, which is another good synonym for differences, widely in terms of prioritizing and time management. So here our writer once again has reminded us of the thesis, both of our topics and the rhetorical mode, and told us what this paragraph is going to be about. Continuing that trend, finally, college is often overlooked as being a luxury and can be seen as a burden. One can easily see how these attitudes can be attributed to active students and passive students, respectively. So a little bit of a different introduction here, but she has talked about differences, right? Luxury and burden. These are different attitudes. So she didn't super explicitly state it, but she has given us different attitudes that can be attributed to active and passive students, respectively. And then she goes on to talk about the attitudes the different types of students have. And so even though it's not as explicit as these first two topic sentences, she still tells us the differences, or that she's talking about differences, active, passive student, and that she's going to talk about the attitudes. And if we go back up to our thesis statement, you can see she's done exactly what she promised to do. Paragraph 1 talks about motivation. Paragraph 2 talks about prioritizing and time management. And paragraph 3 talks about overall attitude and involvement. And there's no doubt when we get to the end of this essay exactly what Jane Weaver meant to do in her essay, and she did it very successfully. So you can refer back to this essay as you're writing your own compare and contrast essay. And again, as always, if you have any questions as you work, be sure to let me know.